The man standing before the gates of the castle was not dressed like anyone else in the kingdom. He wore no fancy clothes, only simple traveling garb, and he had nothing to prove that he was a lord or even a knight. The guard felt uneasy about opening the gates for this stranger, but his duty was to protect the castle, not judge those who came to it. So he let him in. When the man stepped into the courtyard, everyone stared at him. He wasn't just dressed strangely, he also carried himself with an air of confidence that demanded attention. And when he looked back at them, they saw something that made their blood run cold. A face devoid of any emotion, pale skin, sharp cheekbones, angular jaw, and eyes that seemed to pierce through everything. It was then that the castle doors opened and a young man stepped out. He was the prince of the kingdom. He had been home for a few days after finishing his training abroad. When he saw the stranger, he felt a pang of familiarity, as if he had seen the man before, but he couldn't place it. "Who are you?" the prince asked, his voice echoing in the courtyard. "Why have you come here?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around, taking in the scene before him. He then turned back to the prince and said, "I am here to see your father. I have a message for him." The prince frowned. "And what message would that be?" he asked. "A message of warning," the man replied, his voice low and dangerous. "Your father should not have interfered in matters that did not concern him." The prince's eyes narrowed. "And who exactly are you to tell me this?" he asked, his hand instinctively moving to the sword at his hip. "Someone who knows more than you think," the man replied, a smirk playing on his lips. He then took a step closer to the prince and whispered something in his ear. The prince's eyes widened in shock. "How is that possible?" he whispered back. "Let's just say I have my ways," the man replied, backing away from the prince. "Now, if you will excuse me, I have a meeting with your father." Before the prince could say a word, the man had already strode past him and was walking toward the throne room. As the man approached the throne room, whispers followed him like a shadow. Everyone in the castle was talking about him, wondering who he was and what he wanted. Some said he was a spy sent by their enemies. Others claimed he was a madman who had somehow slipped past the guards. But the truth was far more interesting than anyone could have imagined. The man was not a spy, nor was he mad. In fact, he was one of the most feared warriors in the kingdom, someone who had earned the title of Ghost by striking fear into the hearts of their enemies. And he was not just any warrior. He was the very general that the king had been looking for, someone who could lead his army to victory against their enemies. But how did he end up in this strange situation? Well, it all started when the king received a letter from a neighboring kingdom. The letter was a declaration of war, and it was signed by the neighboring king's son, Prince Arthas. But something about the letter bothered the king. The signature was written in a way that was both elegant and powerful, and the king couldn't help but feel that he had seen that signature before. He racked his brain trying to remember where he had seen it, but it eluded him. Days turned into weeks, and the king had to make a decision. He needed to prepare for war, and he needed a general to lead his army. But he couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. He had interviewed many potential generals, but none of them felt right. They were either too old or too inexperienced. Then one day, while walking through the castle, he noticed a young knight practicing with a sword. The knight was skilled, that much was clear, but what truly caught the king's attention was the way he carried himself. There was a quiet confidence about him that reminded the king of someone he had met years ago. The king stopped in his tracks and stared at the young knight. The knight sensed the king's gaze and turned around. The king couldn't believe his eyes. It was him. He was the general that the king had been looking for all along. But how could this be? Wasn't he supposed to be dead? The king had met this man years ago when he was just a young squire. He had impressed the king with his skill and determination, and the king had taken him under his wing. But during a battle, the young squire had been caught in an ambush and was presumed dead. The king had mourned the loss of such a promising young warrior. But now he stood before the king once again, older, wiser, and more skilled than ever. The king couldn't believe his luck. He had found the general he had been looking for all along. But there was one problem. The king knew that this man was too good to be true. He was talented enough to lead the army to victory, but he was also arrogant and ambitious. The king knew that this man wouldn't settle for being just a general. He wanted more, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get it. The king had seen this look in the man's eyes before. It was the same look that had driven him to conquer new lands and claim new victories. The king knew that he couldn't control this man, not if he wanted to keep him by his side. So he gave him a choice. He could either lead the army to war or become the king's personal knight. The king knew that this was the only way to keep this man in check. If he became the king's personal knight, he would be loyal to the crown. He would have to put the king's needs above his own and serve him directly. The king knew that this man wouldn't accept this arrangement willingly, so he gave him an ultimatum. Become the king's personal knight, or leave the kingdom with nothing but the clothes on his back. The king watched as the man made his decision. He knew that he had won. This man was too ambitious to choose anything but victory. But he was also too proud to accept defeat. The king was right. The man chose to become the king's personal knight, but not without making it clear that he was only doing it temporarily. The king accepted his terms and named him the commander of the royal guard. The king knew that this was only a matter of time before this man would try to take the throne for himself. But he was willing to risk it. He needed this man's skills to win the war, and he couldn't do it without him. So the king and the general worked together to prepare for the war. The king learned that the general was a master tactician and strategist, and he used this knowledge to his advantage. The king was able to rally the troops and supplies needed to win the war, and the general trained the soldiers and developed battle plans. Together, they led their army to victory, and the kingdom was saved. But the king knew that this was only the beginning. He could feel the general's ambition growing with each passing day, and he knew that sooner or later, he would have to face his former student. In the meantime, he enjoyed the peace that he had fought so hard to win, knowing that he had the best warriors in the kingdom by his side. And that's exactly how the story ended, leaving the audience on a cliffhanger, wondering what would happen next.